Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of the Hague Program for Cyber Norms annual conference. Last day in the program, we've had two, from our view at least, very successful days. Very happy with that. Today, we continue the program. In just a few moments, we'll be having a keynote by Mariarosaria Taddeo on deterrence and norms to foster stability in cyberspace. After that, I'll be doing some very dynamic running and going over to a different place in this building to make sure I can participate in the next panel on how it applies international law and responsible state behavior in cyberspace. That is our morning program. We'll continue, we'll update you on the rest of the program later at the end of that panel. For today, we're starting with the keynote by Mariarosaria Taddeo. Mariarosaria is a senior research fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute of the University of Oxford, where she's also the deputy director of the Digital Ethics Lab. She's also affiliated with the Alan Turing Institute as the Defense Science and Technology Fellow. Her area of expertise is philosophy and ethics of information. She is an acclaimed scholar, had multiple awards and recognitions for her work, and she's also editor-in-chief of the journal Minds and Machines. She'll be talking to us today about deterrence and norms, which is interesting in many respects, but also in light of our first keynote that we had by Madeleine Carr, who one of the themes she prompted on in her talk was that the nuclear condition sparked a lot of innovative thinking in IR theory, and she was sort of wondering where is the innovative thinking on cyberspace now that we're a good 20 years into cyberspace being perceived as a national security threat. And also she sort of had the question, okay, should we find new concepts or should we build and try to refine older concepts, like, for example, deterrence, which came up very much in the nuclear age. So Mariarosaria, welcome. I'm going to go through 2 more slides to tell you what to do. As before in the conference, you are more than welcome to ask questions to the keynote speaker. You can do so throughout the talk. You have a bar, and all the way on the right, there's 2 speech bubbles with question marks in them. This is where you can submit a question. Please mention your name. We will not be posting anonymous questions, and keep it short and sweet, please. Keep it short. If you want to follow us on our endeavors in this space, you can follow us on Twitter. This is the Twitter handle. And if you want to use the hashtag CyberNorms2020 to have comments and make known what you think of what we're doing here to the outside world, you're more than welcome to. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Mariarosaria Taddeo for her keynote. She'll be speaking for about 40 minutes. Keep the questions coming, and then we'll move to Q&A after the 40 minutes. Mariarosaria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for joining us this morning. I'm going to try to do something very techy, sharing the screen. Hopefully you can all see my slides. So as Dennis, thank you. As Dennis mentioned, today I'd like to talk a little bit more about deterrence and how we can use it in support or together with norms to foster stability in cyberspace. A word of caution, perhaps, or a premise, most of the talk will be philosophical in the sense that we'll focus on conceptual changes that cyber conflicts have brought about, and now we can try to address them in the best possible ways. So in terms of the talk, I have 3 key points to share with you today. The first is about the strategic nature of cyberspace. The second has to do with understanding the nature of cyber conflicts and the risks that we run when we trying to understand these conflicts using analogies with respect to kinetic conflicts or conventional conflicts, and then focus a little bit on deterrence and norms. So without any more premises, let's look at the strategic nature of cyberspace. Now this image here is a rather fancy or a nerdy one, depends on where you stand. It was rather famous when it came out. It's from 2014. It's rather old. 6 years in cybersecurity space or age is a long time, but it was very famous. So it's a snapshot of a dynamic map that Norse, a cybersecurity firm, keeps on its website. They have sensors all over the internet, and the lines that you see, they indicate cyber attacks. Now, at the time, the map was quite famous because it shows more than 4,000 cyber attacks occurring in the span of 1 minute. And the temptation would be to say, well, actually, this was 6 years ago. For sure, we are in a better situation now. For sure, we made progress in terms of security, defense. You will be wrong. Certainly, I was wrong when I had this kind of expectation, because actually data tell us that cyber attacks are escalating with respect to frequency, impact, and level of sophistication. And this was true before the pandemic. During the pandemic, numbers have gone even higher. So just to give a few points of reference, the World Economic Forum publishes a global risk report each year. In 2019, cyber attacks were among the top 5 sources of severe global risks. Gemalto offers some data which are also rather worryingly. In a report, they show that in the first 6 months of 2018, cyber attacks compromised 4.5 billion records, and these data are almost twice the amount of records compromised during the entire 2017. And perhaps what is even more scaring is a study published by Microsoft to tell us that in 2018, 60% of cyber attacks was much quicker, last less than an hour. So that means that there is much less time for security analysts to intervene, and relied on new form of malware, meaning that defense and security would oftentimes be unprepared or not ready to address those attacks. Why is this important? Well, because these are bits of information that tell us about the strategic nature of cyberspace. Now, in cyberspace, when we think about cyber defense and security, attacks which are non-kinetic, so which do not cause physical damage or do not rely on use of force, they are easier to launch than kinetic attacks. You don't have to deploy people, you're not going to possibly destroy anything or kill anybody, and it's cheaper and has a less of a burden on the public opinion if you are a political or a public institutions. Moreover, attacking in cyberspace is much more likely to be effective than defend, and more likely to be effective both because defense are rather porous, so it's quite likely to be able to have access to the target, but also because attribution is still a problem. So even if you fail, it's quite likely that you won't be caught. So the risks are rather low. And this makes cyberspace an offense persistent environment. Now, the definition has been offered by Arknet and Goldman, and they stress that basically cyberspace is not an offense-led environment insofar as it's not a given that the offenders are going to be successful, but it's an offense-persistent environment for 2 reasons. It's so convenient to attack that offense and defense are in constant contact, and moreover, defense can only achieve tactical successes if it manages to be up to date with the means of offending, but it will never lead to any strategic advantage. Now, this is a key point that is going to come back later on when we talk about deterrence. The third element has to do with the consequence of these the first 2 elements, the weaponization of cyberspace. So the idea that in cyberspace it's more convenient to attack and defend, and so acquiring meanings and capability to offend, establishing procedure to offend is the way to go, somehow to protect national security and defense interests. This is a rather vicious cycle, as it were, because if it's not regulated properly, the risks for escalation is quite high. And this is also something that we see happening every day. If you think about the way in which, for example, offensive capabilities are portrayed in the US strategic doctrine documents, or the UK, which last year established a new office for offensive cyber, something that is meant exactly to do this, like leverage offensive capability in cyberspace. So state actors play a key role in this context, and we're going to focus for the rest of this talk particularly on interstate cyber conflicts. The circle here, the virtuous circle, spins a be quicker when we start thinking about latest technologies and new capabilities, and in particular AI. Increasingly, AI becomes a central element of defense and security capabilities of state actors, and the way we talk about AI outside defense as a transformative technology that changes the way in which things are done, offering opportunities and challenges, applies to the case of cybersecurity and defense. AI is a transformative element of this domain as well, posing challenges and opportunities. And I think this is a moment where we should really focus on the way AI impacts on the many variables that we consider when we think about defense and security. Let me just list them here and see how they are related to AI. So there are common issues, common insofar as they are central to the debate on the governance of AI for security and defense. So we have responsibility, attribution, control, the establishing of red lines, escalation, and the way state actors in this context might behave, but also issues which are more technical, having to do with guaranteeing system robustness, system resilience, response, and also deterrence. I'm going to delve into this in a moment. At this high level, at this point, we can see that AI has an impact almost on all these aspects. It does not have an impact, so we will not focus on this for the rest of this talk, on two elements, which are the definition of red lines and the regulation of state behaviors or actors' behavior, because these are topics which are regulated mostly on the basis of political views rather than technical capabilities. So we will not focus on this for the rest of this talk. But then AI has a huge impact on issues concerning responsibility, control, and escalation, insofar as it makes it harder to ascribe responsibility, maintain control of responses, what we call meaningful control, and poses risks of escalation, actually makes these risks much, much higher. It's not all negative, the impact of AI when it comes to defense and security, because actually AI helps on all these other topics that you find highlighted in gray. We're going to see that AI might help in tackling the issue of attribution, which is rather central when you talk about defense and security. But it also helps with respect to system robustness, resilience, response, and we'll see also deterrence. So let me just specify, system robustness refer to the process through which we go when we deploy new software for defense and security, and we need to make sure that that software has no bugs. So AI is very useful and very effective in supporting the verification and validation processes, and this is a job that takes time to security analysts, takes energies, and AI can make it more efficient and free time from human skills. It's also AI very useful in fostering system resilience, so in supporting threat and anomaly detection. There are companies who sell AI softwares which can monitor key infrastructures, for example, and identify attacks as they come in, and even quarantine the areas which are attacked, so to mitigate risks of the attack. And we're going to see now AI also helps with system responses, so the idea that we can counter an attack relying on AI capabilities. This specific skill or this specific use will be relevant for the idea of developing a new form of deterrence in cyberspace. Let me focus a bit more on system response, just to make sure that it's clear. We're talking about uses of AI and way of running cyber conflicts, or the way cyber conflicts are waged based on current and feasible uses of technology, and not drilling towards any form of science fiction. So the picture that you see here was very famous 2016. It comes from the DARPA Cyber Grand Challenge. This was kind of a historical moment for the cybersecurity and defense community. It was the first time that AI systems, 7 in this case, could play and finish a war game, capture the flag. So these 7 systems were fighting against each other. Each system was identifying its own vulnerabilities and patch them. So you remember the system robustness, but also identifying vulnerabilities in other systems and strategize on how and when to attack so to take the other systems down. The challenge identified very important capabilities which are being used these days for countering attacks, but it also poses or stresses that there are a few risks and challenges that might come when we use AI for national security or defense purposes. So the picture here, and I apologize for the low quality, this is what Science Robotics shared with us after publication. The picture here offers a high-level map of the challenges that AI brings about. The blue circles refers to ethical challenges, and for once we're not going to focus on them. But the red circles, they refer to the security problems that AI brings about. And at a very high level, two problems are very important: escalation and lack of control. They were also in the previous slides. There is a notable absent here, which is responsibility. It's not because I don't think the responsibility is not a problem, or is a problem. It's more that responsibility gap when it comes to AI and defense would require all other keynote. So for the sake of time and focus, I decided not to add it here, but happy to discuss it in the Q&A. So what are the risks when it comes to escalation and lack of control? So the idea, as you saw from the DARPA Cyber Grand Challenge, is that at each interaction, AI refines its own behavior. And you can imagine within the capture the flag game, for example, that at each round, AI will refine its strategies and launch more aggressive counter operation. It's not unlikely that this can snowball into an intensification of attacks and response, which in turn may actually create serious threats to infrastructures of our societies. The moment in which infrastructure starts to be powered, or infrastructure starts to be powered with AI-based system for responses, and this might undermine actually stability. And by the way, we know now, we've known for a few years that key infrastructures are targeted by states. Russia versus US is a key example in 2018 and earlier on this year. Lack of control, or what we call meaningful control, comes with the very nature of AI. AI is based on kind of a pervasive distribution, insofar as systems are actually a combination of systems, multiple interaction, very fast-paced execution, which make very hard for humans to be in control of what AI systems are actually doing, or what could be the likely consequences, and so make control less effective at each interaction, quite likely. And so this poses risks which are developing unforeseen consequences or unwanted consequences, which we might identify as a community too late, error which might go unnoticed, and also increase the responsibility gap. So far, the strategic nature of cyberspace. A lot of opportunities, but also a lot of problems, which are both ethical. I'm an ethicist, so that's a key focus of my work, but also, as you might have seen, conceptual. And I'd like to delve into this a bit more in the second part of this talk. And understanding the nature of cyber conflicts. In this part, we're going to take a step back and a detour, but I promise that we won't get lost. So at the end, things will converge again. So the step back is going back to the way we understand or consider cyber conflicts. There's like a literature of about 15 years of study on this topic, and the temptation is, or the way of approaching it, is to think about cyber conflicts or conflicts as happening in two domains: the physical and the cyber. And you have on the one side physical agents, physical targets, and they interact with level of violence which are medium or high. And then you have the cyberspace, where you have digital agents, digital targets, and very low level of violence. There is no use of force, and things are quite neatly separated one from the other. The approach in understanding cyber conflicts at this point has been, in many cases, I'm going to give you an example during our detour in a moment, the one on relying on analogies. We compare cyber conflicts to kinetic conflicts, and for sure some kind of understanding will come out. we will have some guidance in identifying rules, in identifying problems, and offer a solution. If you look carefully, that's what you're doing. You're comparing apples to oranges. Cyber conflicts and kinetic conflicts, yes, to stay within the analogies, two pieces of fruit, both round. Data is completely different. And the analogy is very limited in its conceptual validity, and the risk of being misleading and lead to serious problems is quite high. This is what we learned with the Italian manual, for example. This is our detour. I won't focus too much, but it's a concrete example of how the analogy-based approach to understand the nature of cyberspace has strong limitations, which can actually hamper eventually stability in cyberspace. So let's focus on the way the Italian manual first version defines cyber attacks. And so they look at cyber operation and cyber attacks, and a cyber attack is considered something that amounts to an armed attack when it is a cyber operation, whether offensive or defensive, that is reasonably expected to cause injury or death to person or damage or destruction to object. Now the catch is that a cyber operation is counted as a cyber attack only when it is comparable to an armed attack, and so only at that point is something that we should regulate. At the first glance, it makes all the sense in the world, this definition, but if you look at it more carefully, when you start seeing that a cyber attack we should regulate is one that causes injury to or death to person, damage or destruction to objects. But all the cyber attacks that we've known so far in the public domain, at least, well, forget about Stuxnet perhaps, but they don't destroy and they don't damage objects and they don't lead to the death of a person, at least not people, at least not directly. They stay below this threshold. They're all very much about remaining within the non-kinetic, the non-physical, the cyber realm. And so the consequences of having an approach which is based on analogies is between kinetic and non-kinetic forms of conflicts and attacks is actually to leave unregulated the bulk of the phenomenon, unregulated the source of threats for stability. And this is something that percolates also in the version 2, in the second edition, the cyber attacks, where aside from like an admirable way of using words to let's say, shade the phenomenon, and so distinguishing, for example, between countermeasures and self-defense. Most of what we consider cyber attacks, according to the second version of the Italian manual, is qualified as cyber espionage, and as such not regulated. But indeed are these attacks that we consider today are threats to stability in cyberspace and international stability. So end of the detour, the message to retain from that is that when we look about or look at cyber conflicts in a kinetic and based on an analogy with kinetic conflicts, we are doing that on the basis of an analogy approach, which is misleading. And is misleading, and here comes a little bit of philosophy, because when we look at the digital, we're not looking at apple and oranges. We're looking at new phenomenon, which most likely combines existing things, producing new things, like this very weird piece of fruit here. Now, the idea is not mine, I won't take credit for it, but it comes from a colleague of mine here in Oxford, Luciano Floridi, who, when referring to the digital, says, well, the digital cuts and pastes reality in the sense that it couples, decouples, recouples futures of the world and our corresponding assumptions about them, creating entirely new phenomenon. It is limiting to wanting to address this new reality, which the digital revolution, the information revolution has created, looking at it with very old lenses. So when we look at cyber conflicts, we don't really have anymore two domains separated one from the other. The two domains have been merged. And so conflicts range from relying on physical to digital agents. They can pose physical to digital threats. And the level of violence can escalate from very low to a maximum to a maximum level. And this is why when we try to understand cyber conflicts on the basis of analogy, well, we're basically trying to do the proverbial thing, no, of trying to push the square peg into the round hole. You're not gonna play this game. You're gonna smash the toy, and that's the risk that we run, is that we force a new phenomenon, cyber conflicts, into old categories. Now, this is something that for many years I've been predicating, feeling very much at times the philosopher talking conceptual to practitioners. But then I was very happy a few years ago when I found this quote from US Commander Robert Weber, who put it very clearly, I believe. He said, well, history suggests that applying the wrong operational framework to an emerging strategic environment is a recipe for failure. During World War I, both sides failed to realize that large-scale artillery barrages, followed by massed infantry assaults, were hopeless on a battlefield that strongly favored well-entrenched defense supported by machine gun technology. The failure to adapt had disastrous consequences. Now, here the context is very dramatic, and we know all about the carnage that World War I was. But it's true, the failure to adapt has disastrous consequences, and it could pose very dramatic consequences also in this context. So we need kind of to adapt our thinking. We need to evolve our thinking and understand what are the differences, what are the changes that digital technologies, AI in a moment, we're going to focus on it, but more broadly digital technologies have brought about when it comes to cyber defense. And I think one of the compelling examples of this kind of changes comes when we think exactly about the nature of defense. Now, this is a fortress, and is perhaps the most paradigmatic example of defense we can think of, right? And the fortress serves to double function. It protects everybody who's inside, but also it fences off attacks that comes from outside. So security and defense are coupled, they come together. But if we think about these days, about security and defense in the context of cyber, well, they actually start to be very much separated. Security is more and more a matter of engineering, is a matter of design, is a matter of system robustness and system resilience. So how you design your system and how you monitor your system. Defense is increasingly more about responding, about countering, is the offensive cyber capabilities that the UK, the US, to some extent even NATO is starting to rely on. When we think about this kind of separations, well, it becomes clear that we have new capabilities, we also have a new phenomenon, and understanding and regulating it, it's essential to make sure that these new capabilities don't take us to on the wrong path. So to end the metaphor of the toy, we need a new game, we need a new toy, we need to evolve our thinking. We need to shift from analogies to understand cyber conflicts to an approach that allow us to make sense of the cut and paste of the digital, of the malleability of cyber conflicts, but also to be holistic in our understanding of this phenomenon. So, as we're going to see in a few minutes, to understand the role of different actors, the private, the public sector, the distinction between military and civil, and all in all of the nature, not just of cyber conflicts, but of the information warfare. So of the all ways, or the all possible ways in which information or digital technologies can be weaponized for security and defense purposes. And this will lead us to understand norms or define norms that regulate state conducts, tech providers and users in cyberspace. These are 3 steps, kind of incremental steps, but if we fail the first, as is with the analogy approach, we're going to fail the second, and we're never going to achieve a third one. And I guess that on the failure of establishing norms for state regulation in cyberspace, we have plenty of examples. Key one is the failure of the UNGG 3 years ago. So this takes me to the last part of the talk, and focusing on deterrence and norms. Let me just focus straight on what the understanding of what deterrence is, because that's the starting point. When we think about the international arena and we think about threats, conventional deterrence theory and even nuclear deterrence theory, it relies on 3 elements. You need to have attribution, you need to have credible signaling, and you rely on defense and retaliation. Now, attribution is the key element because it's the target of your credible signaling. Is if you know that a state is about to attack, so you can attribute the intention to attack. You signal the you can defend, so you can actually, technically speaking, deny the attack, make sure that the attack will be a failure, or punish, retaliate. Credible signaling and strategies, so defense or retaliation, they are linked together because for the threat to be effective, there has to be some reputation of the state as its ability to perform what, or let's say, to walk the walk. And at the same time, they also offer the content of the threat. So, in a nutshell, conventional deterrence is basically a coercive strategy, which is based on a conventional conditional threat. And the goal is to persuade the opponent to behave in a desirable way. Now, there is a key element here, which is the conditional threat. If you do A, I'm going to do B, and B is going to be something that will pose more damage to you than the goal that you might achieve if you attack. So it's all based on the future. It's all based on what's going to happen. We will see that this does not really work anymore in cyberspace. Now, when we talk about considering whether we can have deterrence in cyberspace, the two answers that we find in the literature are all based on this model of deterrence. And so there are some who say, well, this model does not work in cyberspace, and they are correct, but then they infer that therefore there is no way we can have deterrence in cyberspace, and they're wrong. Or there are those who say, well, we can implement this model in cyberspace, and we can have therefore deterrence. They are wrong all the way. So let me just delve a little bit more into this model, so to understand what the limitations are. We started off with attribution. Attribution has to be positive and timely. You cannot attribute an attack or an intention to attack too late, because otherwise you cannot deter anymore. And you need to be super sure, because you're going to threaten another state. In cyberspace, this is not possible. At best, in cyberspace, attribution is difficult. It's quite likely that it will be impossible. The distributed, interconnected, global network that cyberspace is makes it very hard to identify with absolute certainty that a given actor is going to attack. And it's also very hard to attribute it post hoc, because cyber attacks rely on technology which is compounded of different elements. Some may have legal or illegal origin. They are rooted through a number of states. So identifying the red threads behind an attack is very hard. So attribution is problematic. And as you can see in this slide here, well, attribution is the key element of deterrence. If that is out of the way, this model does not work anymore. But it's not just attribution that is problematic when we think about cyberspace, it's also the credible signaling. In the context of kinetic conflict, credible signaling is about military parade, is about the history that a state has with respect to its ability to resolve, to retaliate, the level of its defenses. In cyberspace, this is not possible for two reasons. On the one side, you don't show off your cyber capabilities, because the moment in which they are revealed, well, they are voided. It's all about keeping them secret. But also, states might have a reputation which is not really the one, the actual one. Insofar as states might not like or might not want to make public the fact that they've been attacked, they might not want to make public the fact that they might have retaliated or not in the past. So reputation is also very problematic. And what is also very problematic is the strategy for defense, for deterrence, defense or retaliation. I'm going to be very clear about these two elements here, because this is a key point. You can consider defense and retaliation as two elements which combine, two aspects which combine two elements: coercion and control. When it comes to defense, defense is all about control. It's about controlling the incoming attack and making sure that that attack doesn't reach the target. There is also a little bit of coercion, because, well, if I can make sure that the opponent's attack is going to be a failure, I might change the behavior of the opponent. We saw at the start of this talk, defense in cyberspace is quite likely to fail. It's most of the times is ephemeral, and what we know by experience is that the success of deterrence is only tactical, is very limited, and it's just a matter of means, time, and determination for an attack to be successful. So the idea of basing a deterrence theory in cyberspace on defense is a no-go, is another recipe for failure. Retaliation might be more interesting. Retaliation also is compounded by coercion and control. It's more about coercion, it's about punishing, and so changing the behavior by punishing, but it's also about coercion, control. You need to make sure that your punishment is proportionate to the threat, that it doesn't escalate, that is timely, and that so the consequences will stop as soon as it is necessary to do for them to do so. In cyberspace, it's very problematic, and it's problematic for the nature of the means of punishment, cyber weapons. We're talking about tools which can be easily repurposed, accessed by third parties. If they are powered with AI, they can escape control. And so it's very hard to make sure the retaliation will happen in terms of which are proportionate, which are necessary, and so justifiable. Just to give you an example of how likely it is that a cyber weapon escapes the control of the deployer. It's a very famous example. The weaponized part of Stuxnet, which was an attack designed specifically to target a specific machine in a specific place. So the weaponized part, Amber, was sold on the dark web right after the discovery of Stuxnet, and since then has been used to power cyber criminal all over the world. So control is very problematic when it comes to retaliation. What is the lesson to learn here? Well, I've focused so much on the failure of analogies that it might be quite clear. If we try to develop cyber deterrence by analogy with respect to conventional deterrence theory, we're in for failure. Those who think that deterrence in cyberspace does not work, they're correct. This model deterrence does not work. But this does not mean that we cannot have a way of establishing deterrence strategies in cyberspace. We need another shift. That's the key element to focus on. So let's move from kinetic threats and to kinetic context to cyber threats, and trying to understand cyber threats perhaps with one T, not two, as in the slide. Trying to understand, given the peculiarity of this space, of cyberspace, and the nature of cyber conflicts, how we can create a strategy for cyber deterrence. So there are three elements also in this case that might be that are relevant, and these are, let me just move this part, okay. Target identification, retaliation, and demonstration. As I mentioned, attribution in cyberspace is very problematic, and it's not feasible to think that we can base a deterrence strategy on this element. But what we can do is to identify a target. We can identify, for example, the source of an attack. And we can do this, for example, using AI capabilities, but intelligence also help in that context. Once the source of an attack has been identified, the idea is that we don't wonder anymore who's the attacker. We decouple the source of the attack from the attacker, and we can actually target the source of the attack to make it a target of punishment with retaliation. The whole point here is to retaliate by damaging the attacker by destroying or hampering their systems, with the whole goal of demonstrating capabilities, intent, and determination. Now, this model of deterrence is a model that is not based anymore on a conditional threat. It's not about deterring future behavior, but is a model that is based on prevailing. So we do not threat to counter possible attacks in the future, so to change the current plan of our opponent. We demonstrate right now our skills, capabilities, and determination by stopping the incoming attacks, with the idea of, or by punishing the incoming attack, with the idea of stopping future attacks. So it's a matter of prevailing now to deter later rather than deter now. It's too convenient in cyberspace to attack, to consider that any possible threat might actually have an impact or work as a deterrent. Now, this is admittedly a rather aggressive way of approaching deterrence, but I'm also convinced that while it can be effective in discouraging attackers from future plans, by itself, this approach will not be sufficient to guarantee stability in cyberspace. This is a strategy that might work if it's related or coupled with important regulations and important strategies, as it were. And so there are a few that I'd like to list here before the end of my talk. The first is that it's very hard to find and identify global agreement when it comes to developing capabilities and regulate uses of these capabilities. But it's quite easier to do so at a regional level. And so, for example, EU level or NATO level. One key element that has to become mandatory is the sharing and the disclosure of information of vulnerabilities. You might remember WannaCry and the fact that the whole attack started because the information about that specific vulnerability had not been shared by the US with its allies. But also mandatory sparring exercises when we're thinking about using AI for deterrence or defense strategies. AI is a system that improves by working and refines itself by interaction. And within an alliance, if there is one actor who deploys AI for national defense purposes, the robustness of that model has an impact on the stability of the whole alliance. So there should be ways in which we can safely train these systems with sparring exercises to improve, or adversarial training, what we call it technically, will improve, reduce the chances of unintended consequences, errors, and lack of control. There is a need to define red lines and criteria for proportionality, so that we can identify legitimate ways in which we can use cyber and information strategies, especially those based on AI. The whole rhetoric of, if we define a red line, then we define also space under which or below which attackers can move without fear or retaliation, doesn't work anymore. We've seen it in the past few years, where even without red lines, attacks have kept escalating, have kept just becoming more frequent and sophisticated. And then we need to have an authority which is able to monitor state behavior and enforce rule in cyberspace, to audit and oversee states' defense operation, especially if these are based on AI. And so, with respect to the authority, this is a key point. There's no way we can think about norms in the international arena if there is no authority who can enforce them. And we need an authority which is able to ensure state compliance with norms at international level, run investigation in suspected state-run cyber attacks, to define attribution at a political level, expose breaches of norms, and impose sanctions and punishment. The question of authority, of the authority who might do so, is very much open, and we know that the failure of the UN poses question there. But we also know that, for example, this authority cannot stay with the private sector. You might remember the Geneva Digital Convention proposed by Microsoft. That would be seriously problematic, because we're talking about an authority which is able to intervene into international relations and have a strong way of force state to abide to international rules. And so, just to conclude, when thinking about deterrence or over and above deterrence, there are three steps which I think are important. Shifting when it comes to deterrence from countervailing to prevailing. Think about deterrence as something which is necessary to curtail some actors, but not sufficient to maintain stability or foster stability. There is need to define regimes of norms and authority that can enforce them. And conceptually, change approach. We need an holistic approach. And holistic, I know, is a philosophically loaded terms, sometimes opening to a boring interpretation. But I think in this case it's important, because we need to deal with two things. the conceptual changes that the digital technologies brought about, and so the aspects of malleability, scalability of threats, but also consider cyber threats, cyber deterrence as part of a broader phenomenon, which is information warfare. And so the regulation in this context cannot be just focusing on one aspect, the cyber, and forget about, for example, propaganda, fake news, and other forms of weaponization of information. And I think I've reached the maximum amount of time I was allowed, so I'll stop here and I'll thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mariarosaria. I have lots of questions, but we also do not have a lot of time, and we have pressing questions in our Q&A as well. So I'm going to let those prevail for now, because you ended at sort of the relationship between what you're describing and basically stability in the international system. I want to go to one of the questions posed by Alexi Drew from King's College London, so one of your neighbors. And the question is, does the development of adversarial AI for offense or defense technology, does that risk creating another unbalanced global order, similar to the order in nuclear, where states with this capability will be automatically dominant when dealing with states without? So how does this no, let's just take the question.
It's a very good point, and I think part of it, also the premise is correct, and we see what we call the AI cyber arms race. So China has a plan where they're trying to lead and develop AI, so to become a prominent actor in a few decades, and they are developing AI for defense as a key part of their plan. So in China, AI is being developed following what they call a fusion approach. So civilian and military application are not decoupled, they're done together. So the progress is parallel. Russia has also stated publicly, Putin said that whoever is going to control AI is going to be leading or dominant actor in the world, although they focus more on weaponized systems on the battlefield. And the US is doing the same. I think AI is going to make a difference, in international relations and in terms of capabilities and defense capabilities, and also aggressive capabilities. It will depend on how it will be integrated, although in the other capabilities. The threats these days that we face are hybrid threats. So it's not just about AI, it's about the whole surface, the whole territory, and possible attacks. If AI can be used, and the most effective use, I believe, is not so much for countering as much as it will be for what is called situational awareness. So the ability of mapping the surface of attack and identifying where the attack will come from. And that might give a better advantage, let's say an informational advantage, which can then inform responses. But in short, yes, it's going to be a key element.
Okay. Maybe I will slip in one of my questions anyway, sorry. Because a lot of your talk centers on sort of the role of time and the role of speed, basically, right? So there's a lot of things. You mentioned Microsoft at the beginning, 60% of attacks are now done within the hour. You talk about the importance of speed when it comes to retaliation. You talk about the role of AI, which is obviously something that does speed, right? That's the whole point of AI applying these kind of things. But you're also talking about increasing so deterrence by basically having a fairly aggressive approach. So how do these, and you do that in the name of stability, right? So how do all these factors that add up to time and speed combine with a fairly aggressive approach? How is that not a recipe for escalation in its own right?
It's a very good point. I think that there are. It is a matter of logical order. So AI poses a question of control. We don't have at the moment, or it's not that we don't have. It's not clear how we can maintain meaningful control of this technology in all the circumstances. And to me, understanding how this is done is a precondition to harness any possible potential of AI for defense and security, especially the counter one. So that's a key element, and you're totally right there. It would be problematic if we don't have. It's not the question of control is technical, but it's also about governance. So understanding how we deploy AI, when we rule the use of AI, so that internally within the military domain we have control of it, is a key prerequisite, condition requirements there. I also think that in cyberspace, because the dynamic is skewed towards the attack, the only way to stop malicious actor is to show them the attack is going to be more costly to them than not. And so this is why it might help stability, because it can deter by punishment. But as I say, these two elements, without norms, oh yes, of course, then we're going to be in another Far West, which is going to be much more problematic. But this is why this is worrying me, because strategy tells us one thing. Paradoxically, aggressive behavior are going to be more effective in deterring or in fostering stability. And this is not coupled by the other element, which is then we need norms, we need regulation. And this kind of unbalance that is very worrying to me.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, but the holistic approach then also means maybe also a time element, that they all have to move at the same speed. So the norms and the technology. So that might be a big order.
I know this is something that we discuss a lot, and also that technology seems to be always a little bit ahead than regulation. And yeah. I think this is true in the history of innovation, but it's true not all the time. So there is a moment in which innovation, spans and it's like this big boost, and then governance or regulation is like grappling behind. But for how long are we going to say that now digital innovation is going to take us by surprise? A moment comes when digital innovation is not innovation anymore, it's just technology on which we rely. And I think the moment has come up for norms to catch their gap. And there is no excuse, so to speak. That narrative works, but only works for a certain amount of time.
All right, I'm going to go to another one of the questions that came through. You've been criticizing especially Talent Manual 1. So one element of the question, this is a question by Johannes Toenvaak, is what is the opinion about the Talent Manual 2.0, which characterizes interference by cyber means as a violation of state sovereignty? Do you consider that helpful? And then the other one, which I'm interested in, because it also sort of pertains to the question of, okay, does this all apply to situation of warfare, or does it also apply below the threshold, basically? And saying, okay, regarding norms of AI, are you supporting a ban of weaponized AI, analogous to the proposed ban to lethal autonomous weapons? And can that be realistically achieved? So I think what they're asking is, are you also sort of supporting the idea of a ban on automated cyber attacks, so loose from the debate on lethal autonomous weapons?
Okay, very interesting questions. Let's start with Talent Manual. So the second version of the Talent Manual does a great effort to trying to address all the problems with the previous one, and there were a lot of problems. So I mean, I appreciate that work there has been huge. However, I think that the manual does the same mistake. So it's still like looking at a concept which is problematic to adapt to the current situation. Now, digital sovereignty, there are rivers of ink, I guess, about what it means, how do we apply it, what is the context of digital sovereignty. So the fact that they are still hinging regulation on this concept of sovereignty, which is defined very much in Westphalian terms, that's where the problem is, and that's where my problem is with the manual, is this lack of, or this inability to update the conceptual framework to shape. It was not their goal, and so it's not even a failure. They didn't even try to do so, but I think that's what we should be trying. When it comes to weaponized AI within the non-kinetic and the cyber context. Yes and no. I mean, it's a problematic question, because it's like thinking, should we ban autonomous car? And so let me clarify, I'm not talking about lethal autonomous weapon systems. That's a whole different story, and this is not what I'm talking about. When it comes to kinetic things, AI is already embedded in all the infrastructures of defense, so many countries. It's embedded in the security, it's embedded in the countering, it's embedded to some extent even in the logistics and the battlefield. There might not be full autonomy, but it's already there. So, and I'm worrying that if we think about, okay, we're going to ban autonomous responses in cyber, then we think that the problem is solved. It's not, because AI is already there and is making decisions which need to be regulated. So the discussion, I think, has to be kept open so that we can maintain an open discussion on all the possible uses and implementation.
All right, thank you. I have a question from Jurian Spierenburg, who's a student here at the University of Leiden, and I'm going to paraphrase a little. So you talk about sort of the integration and the regulation of AI sort of in the military domain. And he's asking, okay, is this going to be a model for all kinds of other new technologies? Will they follow the same track? And he's specifically flagging quantum computing technology, for example. So is the thinking we're doing now with integrating a new technology or a set of technologies, basically, of AI, is that going to be a model for different technologies as well, or do we need to have new thinking on that as well?
It depends on the technology, right? So from my point of view, so the question that I focus on, the normative or the conceptual one, they hinge on the kind of changes or possibility that technology brings about. The point with AI is this kind of level of autonomy and very high-speed efficient behavior, which hinder human control and prediction. And this is all we're discussing here in a specific context, the one of domain. Quantum computing, yes, I think some questions will overlap, but the fact with innovation is that it surprises us. So the gap we were discussing before, that's going to come again. The more innovation will come in. My word of course will be just, let's not just indulge and think that because there is a gap, then we can stay in that gap. At some point, the gap shrinks.
Close it, yeah. I want to go to a question by Neil Ashdown from Royal Holloway, which is interesting because it also crossed my mind, and seeing it, so he says, okay, what do you think the consequence will be if multiple states adopt strategies like persistent engagement and defend forward, which seem to fit, but that's up to you to say, seem to fit fairly well with sort of the aggressive stance on deterrence you have. What would that do in terms of escalation? What would that do in terms of the overarching regime in which this should take place?
So if that's adopted without regulations for state behavior, we are in a deeply problematic situation, and that's something I would like to stress. Deterrence is a tool. If there are no regulation, deterrence does not work, especially an aggressive one. I think it can be useful to stop malicious actors, especially when we think about the fact that some of those cyber attacks can come from rough actors or rough states or actors who are difficult to deter with other means, like economic or political. That might be useful, but there has to be like clear boundaries.
All right, and maybe because we keep bumping into this idea of sort of, so we need sort of the normative framework or the legal framework to keep pace with sort of the conflict in the. So are you optimistic about the pace that the normative process is going? Not wink wink.
Well, no, really. I mean, like the failure of the UNGG 3 years ago was a big. Well, not a shock, but you show that there is a huge problem, and there is a political problem which has to be addressed. But I think it was also a failure that we can try to look at it in a proactive way and understand that perhaps when it comes to cyberspace, the idea of having to start off with global regulation might not be the best way of approaching it. We might start to think of regulations which are developed on regional or coalition. And one thing that has escaped us, because we focused so much on the technology, is that, and it goes back to the holistic approach, you can entrench state behavior regulation with other forms of regulations that states are abiding to. If you think, for example, about the economy, the digital market, because the infrastructure is the same and the targets are going to be the same. The distinction between civil and military is not there anymore. So the regulation approach also needs to be a little bit more open to like a more holistic look at this phenomenon. That might help.
Okay, I'm gonna take two questions together for a last, and I'm afraid you're gonna have to be fairly short in your answer to them, even though they're huge questions. But still, there's two questions that sort of both pertain to the issue of, okay, given the domain that we're in, should we also look to the private sector in terms of deterrence and defense, etc.? So one person is asking in the direction, okay, sort of private hackbacks, which is one element of the field, and one other person is much more in the domain of saying, okay, do we need more civilian resilience? Basically, do we need more education? So there's a wide spread in those two questions. But the main tenet being, okay, what is the role for private actors, citizens, etc., in such a model of deterrence and defense?
Okay, there are three quick points. I'll say so. First one, yes, cyber hygiene education training is important. Let's now make sure that this becomes a way of offloading responsibility for security onto the citizens or the users. The providers, yes, they do have responsibilities, but the responsibilities need to be defined within the context of procurement. So what kind of technology do we procure? So as you were, I think providers need to be abiding to requirements which are set by public authorities. And this takes me to the third element, the hackback, the proposal we saw in the US a few years ago. That's like carrying a weapon for your own defense on the streets. Defense is a state responsibility. The stakes are high. The risks are even higher. This is not something that we can delegate, or should we delegate, to the private sector. I think that the other element is perhaps make sure that we can keep abreast with the technology, keep abreast with innovation, and make the best use of it. But one domain in which private and public need to be separated is the one of international defense, national defense and international relations.
Okay, that's a very clear answer. Mariarosaria, thank you very much for being with us this morning. Thank you for talk. I thought it was fascinating. And again, we have more questions than time, so that tells you something about the quality of the talk. Thank you again. We're going to reconvene here in 15 minutes, so I have time to round down the halls and go to a different place. And Elster Busser will be chairing the next session. We'll be going blank. Thank you again, Mariarosaria, and we'll be back in 15 minutes with the next panel on international law in cyberspace.
Thank you, and thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.